Hello guys, it's StudyBug, and today I'm going to be doing a complete AP Psychology last minute review. So what psychology is the study of behavior and mind. Some important people that we need to keep in mind is René Descartes, who talks about how the mind is not subject to natural law, John Locke, who talks about empiricism and how people are born knowing nothing, tabula rasa, which means blank slate in Latin, Thomas Hobbes, which talks about materialism, how matter and energy exist only, and then Charles Darwin, who talks about evolution. The next thing we need to keep in next more people that we need to keep in mind is Wilhelm Wundt, who's the father of psychology. He talked about introspection and examining one's thoughts. Then there was Edward Titchener, who focused on structuralism, which focuses on the structure of the mind broken down in parts. Then William James, who talked about functionalism, which is how the mind allows us to act in the real world. So there are many types of psychology. There's biological psychology, which focuses on the interaction between anatomy and physiology. Then there's behavioral psychology, which focuses on the study of observable behavior. Then there's cognitive psychology, which focuses on how you think. Then there's humanistic psychology, which focuses on the study of free will and the conscious. When studying psychology, you might want to conduct experiments. So experiments are investigations to understand cause and effects. There's independent variables, which is what you're changing, dependent variables, which is what you're measuring, population, which is the group you're studying, and control group is the standard group where comparisons are made. And then when you're having a control group, you want to use a placebo, so which is a pill with like no value that doesn't have any effect to make sure that they're not influenced in any way. So there can be different types of biases. So bias of selection is when people are selected in a physical place. So if you ask people if they like shopping and then you only survey people at the mall, that's not proper. That's going to be sampling bias. Diffuse self-selection is when people have control whether or not to participate. So like on online surveys where mostly people with strong opinions would participate. Then there's pre-screening. So advertising may skew the sample. So if you advertise to people that want to quit smoking, then that might influence your results. Then there's healthy user, which means the people who are tested are in better shape. To prevent biases and errors, you, you should use the single blind procedure so test subjects don't know if they're in the controlled group or experimental group, or the double-blind procedure so the researchers and the test subjects don't know who's in the control group and who's in the experimental group. You'd also have to make sure that your population is representative of the sample size. Other approaches besides experiments are case studies when you're studying a single individual, surveys when you're asking a certain group of people how they feel, naturalistic observations when you're observing the environment naturally, like Jane Goodall and her chimps. And while you're doing these, you have to make sure that your tests are valid and reliable. Reliable means that it's consistent, and valid is how accurate the experiment measures the desired behavior. Some types of statistics are descriptive statistics, which describes the data. So mean, median, and mode. Mean is the average, median is the middle, and mode's the most. There's also inferential statistics, which measures how likely the result will occur. So that's like a t-test, the t-test, or the f-test. And then there's standard deviation, which measures the dispersion of the data. When you're conducting experiments, you have to make sure that the test subjects are informed, that they're debriefed of what happened, and that the results are kept confidential for the safety of and privacy of the test subjects. So these are a curve that shows the different how it can be skewed differently, and as you can see, the positively skewed is has all is like slowly goes down, and then like negatively skewed is like going uphill. This shows correlation. So correlation is how two variables relate, and you should remember that correlation does not equal causation. So the closer the number is to 1 signifies how strong the correlation is. So the one on the left is positive correlation, the one in the middle is no correlation, and one on the right is negative correlation. So now we're moving on to biological aspects. So what neurons are is basically the building blocks of the nervous system. The different parts of the neuron. The dendrites receive the message. The axons pass the message through the branch. The terminal branch forms a junction with other cells. The synapse is where the axon and dendrite have a gap, and the myelin sheet encases the axon to enable the speed. There are different types of neurons. One of them is the afferent neurons, which is basically sensory, and motor neurons, which basically helps you move your body. Okay, so what neurotransmitters are messengers that can cross between neurons. These are more electric, while hormones are more chemical. So acetylcholine enables, these are all neurotransmitters. Acetylcholine enables muscle action. Dopamine is movement, learning, attention, and motion. Serotonin is mood, hunger, sleep, and arousal. Norepinephrine is alertness and arousal. GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, and glutamate is an excitatory. So the parts of the nervous system is the CNS, which is the central nervous system. So that's basically your brain and spinal cord, responsible for sensory activities, memories, and emotion. And your peripheral nervous system sends those messages to the CNS to the rest of your body. Those are the nerves. So within the PNS, there's the somatic, which is voluntary actions, and autonomic, which is involuntary actions. Within that, there's sympathetic, which is your fight response, flight or fight response, and then parasympathetic, which is your rest and relaxation. So there are many parts of the brain. The three layers of the brain is the brainstem, limbic system, and the cerebral cortex. The old brain structures are the thalamus, which directs the messages, the pons, which directs your movement, medulla, which is heart rate and breathing, reticular formation, which is arousal, and the cerebellum, which is the part of the brain that processes sensory output, movement, and balance. So this is next part is the limbic system, which is the hippocampus, which is consciousness and memories. The amygdala, neural clusters linked to emotion. Hypothalamus, eating, body temperature, and governs the endocrine system. And the pituitary gland, which regulates the growth and control. So the different lobes that the brain can be split up into is the frontal lobe, which is speaking, plans, judgment, parietal lobe, which is touch and position, occipital lobe, which is information from visual fields, and temporal lobes, which is auditory information. Next are the cortexes. The motor cortex is voluntary movements. Somatosensory cortex is the touch and movement. So the right and left brain are connected by the corpus callosum, and then for speech, there's two different areas that you need to know. There's a Wernicke's area, which helps with understanding, and Broca's area, which helps with speaking. Cerebral dominance or split brain is something what happens when the corpus callosum is damaged and you can't connect thoughts. So these are the visual pictures that can help you visualize the parts of the brain. I'm gonna pause here for a second so you guys can look at it. Next part are brain scans. So these are technologies to study the brain. The EEG records the brain waves. The CT uses X-rays to see a slice of the brain. A PET detects the radioactive glucose. MRI is a magnetic field and shows the radio waves. The fMRI sees the blood flow of the brain. And one word to keep in mind is neuroplasticity, which is the ability of the brain to change. Moving on, we're going to talk about senses. So there's vision, and how that works is the lens focuses on the image and the light hits the retina. The information is processed by the bipolar and ganglion cells, and within that there's the rods, which are for darker images, and cones for color. The neural impulses that travel through the optic nerve. There are binocular clues, which is the depth clues that require both eyes. Monocular clues, which are distant objects are less clear than closer ones. So both eyes view things differently, and this is called retinal disparity. And it's using both eyes is important in gauging how far away objects are in like 3D vision. So another sense we should know is hearing. So the sound basically travels through the auditory canal, causes vibration in the eardrum. The bones in the middle ear amplify these and relay them to the cochlea. The basilar membrane triggers movements of the tiny hair cells, and that basically relays the message to the brain via the thalamus. So there are two types of hearing loss and deafness. Conductive is damage to the middle ear, and sensorineural is damage to the hair cells. And then two other senses you should know is gustation and olfaction. So these are the parts of the eyes and ears that you should keep in mind. Also, there are two different theories for the eyes. One is the Young-Helmholtz theory, and the other is the opponent process theory. The opponent process theory is basically that there's like two opposing colors that you either well, let me rephrase that. You have like two opposing colors, and then for the trichromatic theory, Young-Helmholtz trichromatic theory, is basically when you have like basically three different colors, and you have like three different receptors within your eye that corresponds with those specific colors. So when your brain receives these senses, it changes the stimuli to sensation, which is called transduction. Then you should know the definition of sensory adaptation, which is the change over time of the responsiveness to the stimuli. So if you get used to a certain stimuli, then you start to not notice it as much. And there's certain called and thresholds that you need to like pass in order to notice the sensation. There's absolute threshold, which is the lowest level of stimuli an organism can detect 50% of the time. Then there's just noticeable difference, which is the amount something needs to be changed that an organism can detect a change 50% of the time. Then there's signal detection theory, which measures the ability to differentiate between information. So the types of processing is perceptual processing, which is the binding problem, bottom-up processing, and top-down processing. What top-down processing is it's basically guided by higher mental processes, so like perception. Then bottom-up is mostly with just sensory information, so that would be sensation. So there's something called selective attention, is that's when we focus on a particular stimuli, and then that causes inattentional blindness, so we fail to see visible objects when we're focused on something else. And yeah, that's kind of has to do with change blindness, is when you fail to notice changes in the environment because you're so focused on what you're looking at. So this also has to do with sensation and perception. Perceptual consistency is the tendency to see objects that have similar characteristics. And there's figure and ground, which so you're identifying a picture from the background. There's closure, and it tends to finish when you tend to finish a sequence an item. Then these are like the Gestalt laws, which perceptual grouping, so when you perceive objects as an organized pattern. Law similarity, so things have shared visual characteristics, so you automatically group them together. There's law proximity, so where things that are closer belong together. And then there's law of common fate, so objects moving in the same direction belong together. So next thing we're talking about is consciousness. So we're talking about sleep first. So sleep basically happens. There are different cycles that happen when you're sleeping, and each cycle is like 90 minutes. And the parts of the cycle is REM, which is rapid eye movement when your vivid dreams occur, and REM1, which when we're experiencing floating and falling sensation, and REM2, which is rapid bursts of rhythmic brain activity. So that's when sleep spindles occur. Then NREM3, which is deep sleep with large slow delta waves. The different types of wave is beta wave, which is wide and awake, delta, which is deep sleep, which usually happens at stages 3 to 4, and yeah. So when stages 3 to 4 eventually disappear as you go further into the night, and when you go further into the night, REM increases as well. Another state of altered consciousness is hypnosis. When we're hypnosis, we're in an altered state of consciousness, and we're open to suggestion, and we can only be hypnotized. You can only be hypnotized if you want to be hypnotized. So the following are some sleep disorders. The sleep apnea, usually common in like when you're overweight or obese, and that's when you have trouble breathing. Night terrors, which is episodes of screaming, intense fear, and flaying while still asleep. It's often occurring with sleepwalking, sleepwalking occurs stages 3 to 4 of sleep when an individual walks around. Then there's narcolepsy, which is the inability to stay awake. So you suddenly fall asleep at inappropriate times. And also keeping sleep in mind, when you have a decrease of sleep and you have less REM sleep, then the next couple nights you'll have an increase in REM sleep to make up for that. So another thing to keep in mind is unconscious behavior is beyond awareness, and the levels of a conscious mind are preconscious and unconscious. Some theories of why we dream is Freud's wish fulfillment. So it's like basically a psychic safety value to express your feelings and how manifest and latent content. Then there's informational processing where dreaming basically helps us sort the day. Another theory is physiological, so it helps preserve neural pathways. Another theory is neural, so that basically dreams just evoke random visual memories. And another one is cognitive, which dreams basically show a dreamer's knowledges and understanding. These are all just theories, and no one's really sure which one is true. Next topic is learning. So the difference between learning and instinct is instincts are in your genetic makeup, but behaviors and things that you're learning are taught. There's simple learning, which is the behavior towards a stimulus, and there's complex learning where you have to integrate knowledge, skills, and attitudes. So one famous psychologist is Ivan Pavlov, who discovered classical conditioning. He developed the idea of classical conditioning by ringing a bell every time he served the dog. This caused the dog to have a conditioned response to drooling every time he hears a stimulus. In classical conditioning, there's a neutral stimulus. The stimulus before conditioning which elicits no response. There's the unconditioned stimulus would be the food here. The conditioned stimulus would be the whistle or bell. The unconditioned response is drooling, and the conditioned response is drooling to the bell. When you learn something new or acquire it, that's called acquisition. And sometimes when the conditioned stimulus disappears, the subject stops responding, which is called extinction. Next is discrimination. So that's the ability to discern between different stimuli. And then the next one is spontaneous recovery, which is the stimulus is reintroduced and conditioned response occurs again after extinction. Another type of conditioning is operant conditioning.